Ghost of Tsushima was probably my favorite game I played last year. It gave me the feeling I had over a decade ago playing Assassin's Creed 1 for the first time. Combat was punchy, rooftop stealth felt rewarding, the story was evocative, the setting was magical, all of it was terrific. I think Tsushima is pretty perfect and deserves all of the praise it has received. But there is one issue with the game that will forever nag at me, and at first I never really noticed it because of some of my baked-in assumptions about the game and about game design and about gaming as a whole. It was only in conversation with a friend, and then thinking back on Jin Shikai's journey, was I able to articulate what was the pestering problem I couldn't name before. Spoiler warning. The problem with Tsushima, in my eyes, was making the player decide in the game's conclusion whether Shimura lives or dies. One thing The Last of Us 2 does really well is not let the player choose between two visible options that Ellie could have made at the end of the game. There's this discussion here among some game reviewers where one of them raises the idea of...
I agree with you guys, by the way. I wish there had been a choice to be made in that moment, and it's baffling to me that there wasn't.
This idea of giving the player the final climactic choice is not uncommon because its design is fairly usual in gaming. Mass Effect, Far Cry 3, Life is Strange, Dragon Age Origins, all are examples of this kind of final choice scenario. It happens in both RPGs and non-RPGs, an important consideration. However, there is something to be said about the efficacy of the design in these games because choice to be choice has to be meaningful and divisive. Meaningful because a choice should render a consequence, otherwise how much agency are we really exerting on the game world? And a choice has to be divisive because if one option is overwhelmingly chosen, that kind of makes it the only option. The scenario is really a non-choice. Games failing on choice design happens more often than we think. Telltale games, for example, they have choices where it doesn't really matter if the player helped Billy or Sally survive that zombie encounter because whoever you chose was still going to die 3 scenes later. The games from French developer Don't Nod, who are the makers of the Life is Strange series, are filled with these kind of endgame episode stats of showing what players choose. I love the parts of these games. They're like mini games to the overall experience. But the transparency here also undermines the creator because there are obvious choice encounters where gamers overwhelmingly decided in favor of one outcome over the other. Mass Effect's 3 ending is another good example. According to a survey in 2015, with a sample size of over 10,000 participants, 50% chose Destroy out of the 3/4 options available. Destroy clearly had the plurality, and nearly the majority. If Mass Effect 3's final choice was designed to be the most meaningful it could be, Destroy Synthesis Control should have been more evenly split across the board. Instead, 1 in every 2 gamers chose Destroy. 1 in every 10 chose Control. It creates the question, was the Control ending really well designed? Were there really 4 options to the ending of Mass Effect, or just 2? Synthesis or Destroy? To me, all of these concerns raise questions about where choice isn't always that good. It's not meaningful and it's not divisive. So my big dumb assumption that I projected onto Tsushima and the players, including my friend, was that the ending with Shimura felt like one of these obvious non-choice scenarios. That this wasn't really a choice, so the player suddenly controlling Jin Shikai's narrative in the 11th hour wasn't a scenario of the gamer being blindsided. Surely the great majority of players would choose to spare Shimura. We will talk about why I was so sure of this later on. For now, my hypothesis that the sparing or slaying of Shimura was going to be a real mother of a blowout. Everybody was going to choose spare. But then I turned to the data. I used 2 different surveys and they show that the margin is very slim. There's this September 2020 thread on Reset Era that had 743 participants, and 44% slew and 56% saved. I conducted my own Reddit poll, oh look at me, in August 2021 on the Ghost of Tsushima subreddit, and I got 157 responses with 48% saying slay and 52% saying spare. So Sucker Punch actually did a really good job of designing choice here. We know that it is inherently meaningful because killing or sparing Shimura is a huge narrative and emotional consequence, but also that the choice was divisive. Players didn't align clearly on one outcome. This wasn't a real mother of a blowout, and my survey was a difference of about 5 gamers, swinging the pendulum either way. As someone who runs tabletop role-playing games, I sometimes obsess over how you can create and design a good choice for a player. Choices shouldn't come from tricking players or necessarily creating moral ambiguity, but rather something that has visible consequences and something that makes everyone really doubt themselves, where you can't truly find consensus on how to proceed, but you have to proceed. Making a choice should be some kind of act of frustration because it isn't perfect. This is why some recent games put in the time crunch of having to make a choice. I think this is a great design consideration when choice is such a big part of the player experience. So in this regard, that idea of momentum of having to make a choice, making it be frustrating, Tsushima clearly nails that. It clearly creates a good choice because it is meaningful and divisive. And if you watch Jin's voice actor make this choice, you can see the frustration and indecisiveness at work, and it's beautiful.
So going in, I had this all like planned out that I thought that I was going to kill Tsushima. I was going to honor him with a death.
So my original hypothesis turned out to be incorrect. The ending with Shimura wasn't a non-choice scenario. In fact, it was clearly a well-done choice design. So then why is the ending of Tsushima still a problem? Well, the problem is that for a game that took me around 35 hours to beat, the only time I was prompted to make a narrative choice was in the final 10 minutes. Tsushima wasn't designed around the player dictating the journey of Jin, and so this sudden decision-making power makes everything feel all at once kind of disjointed, a little blindsiding, and honestly kind of surprising. And there is a gradient of choice in any given game that creates player expectation of how choice should affect the overall experience. Mass Effect, from the screen of character creation, creates a relationship between game and gamer that choices affect dialogue and interaction, and eventually the story of the game. But the problem with Mass Effect's ending, besides its choice design as we already talked about, is that it dismisses a lot, if not all, of your previous actions. Whatever you did beforehand does not influence the choice that you get to make. Its ending is more suited to a game where choice isn't actually central to game design, like Far Cry 3. Far Cry 3's final choice is a failed attempt to be a subversion of the typical white savior adventure narrative and ends up being some sort of colonial nonsense, and the player only really gets to make a narrative choice about Jason Brody again in the final 10 minutes of a 20+ hour adventure. There are games that do choice and deliberateness well. Dishonored's ending is a reflection of all the little choices that the player made. Dragon Age Origins' final battle can be very much influenced on how your decisions have impacted the relationships with your party members in the world. And The Witcher 3 ending depends on how you let Geralt treat Ciri. Tsushima though, Tsushima doesn't let you choose how Jin behaves and interacts with one of the central conflicts of the story. Will Jin save Tsushima Island even if it means forsaking honor, tradition, and the laws of both his uncle and the Emperor? Or more simply, will Jin betray being samurai in order to defeat the Mongol horde? I mentioned previously why I was so certain the choice of Shimura's fate was a non-choice, and this was because I was so convinced that the story would instill in players the need to forsake the code for victory.
The castle is yours. The Khan marches north. We can head him off.
You defied me!
I did what I had to. For them.
Is this how you want to be remembered?
He defended us.
By spreading fear and chaos.
We are at war.
And you are acting like the enemy.
This sequence here, with Jin committing a form of chemical warfare which resulted in a resounding victory, but also his imprisonment. This is after the death of Taka, the slaying of Ryuzo, and the refusal to use Yuna as a scapegoat in order to escape imperial punishment. To me, all of these moments, plus the killing of many Mongols with poisoned milk, had already transformed Jin into the ghost. With certainty, he was no longer a samurai and no longer needed to hold on to the old way of life to save his people. Which to me made the final choice with Shimura very simple. To slay Shimura was to uphold the code, and Jin had parted from the code, but Sucker Punch decided to give this final choice to the players in the game, where players really never got to have an impact on the scale of which Jin battled the internal struggle to be samurai or to not be samurai. This final choice would make a lot more sense if choice was baked into the entire journey of Tsushima, and it feels as though the idea of gameplay choice impacting narrative was right there before all of our eyes. Players can choose how to approach fighting Mongols. Do you call for a duel or do you sneak into camp? Do you call out the final enemies to attack you or do you hunt them down one by one? Do you use poison darts or just bow and arrow and steel? In other words, do you fight like a samurai? Or do you fight like a ghost? If we could have approached Castle Shimura in the same way, I don't think the jarring first, last, and only choice of Tsushima would stick out like such a sore thumb. Rather, our choice to poison or to not would have been reflected in the ending. Tsushima could have embraced choice similarly to Dishonored or The Witcher 3, where the endings align with player decisions. Instead, the choice in Tsushima feels kind of a little bit like an afterthought. It would be like suddenly deciding what Ellie does right at the very end. Or if you got to say that Luke doesn't turn off his lightsaber in the final confrontation in Vader, or Frodo doesn't refuse to drop the ring into Mount Doom. In a game where player agency and narrative isn't an expectation, why do we suddenly have to deal with it and think that that's okay? Player expectation in so many other spaces is so key to the success, but here it's subversion and the shock and the surprise is like, I don't know. It still bothers me. To my friend and to me now too, this all just kind of feels a little misaligned, a little bit off the mark. We really wanted to know how Jin's story ended. Instead, we won't really know, because an inevitable sequel will come, our choice will be overridden for a canon choice. So, to me, Tsushima will never be fully whole. Unlike some of its Sony exclusive peers, the endings of The Last of Us Part 2, God of War, and Spider-Man, they all have very strong, definitive endings. Can you just imagine how these games would have shaped up if they each gave the player the final choice of Kratos, Ellie, and Peter Parker? I think it would have undermined a lot of the experience, but for whatever reason, Tsushima doesn't think this was a problem. We never got to decide if we were the ghost or not in Tsushima until the ending of the game. And something about that, more than spare or slay, is the most bittersweet part of it all.